All right, so today we're going to dive into something pretty tough. How to keep your head up and your faith strong when life just feels so unfair.
Yeah, for sure. I think we can all relate to that in some way.
Right. Like, it's one thing to say, oh, trust in God, but then you get hit with some totally unjust situation, and it's like, okay, but how?
Totally.
So we've got some really interesting stuff to work with today, from Faith Amidst Injustice, The Enduring Presence of God, which is, a pretty deep title, and then this really powerful devotional entry, kind of more personal reflection, that touches on Psalm 139 and Hebrews 13.
Okay.
And what's crazy is they both kind of land on this same idea.
Yeah.
Like how your connection to God, that sense of his presence and favor, it's not like a mood ring changing with every good or bad thing that happens. They're saying it's constant.
Yeah, that's a powerful idea.
It is, right? So
Yeah.
our goal today is to figure out, how do you actually live that out? What does it mean to keep your faith in perspective when you're dealing with stuff that just feels completely wrong?
Yeah, how do you actually apply that to your life?
Exactly.
It's like, okay, that's a nice concept. What does it actually look like when you're in the thick of it?
Totally. Okay, so both of these sources use this super powerful story from the Bible. It's about Joseph, who, let's just say he got dealt a pretty bad hand.
Oh, yeah, Joseph's story is definitely one for the books.
So for anyone who might not know the details, Joseph is betrayed by his own brothers.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about a major betrayal, right? They sell him into slavery.
Wow.
Yeah, awful, right? And as if that wasn't enough, he ends up unjustly imprisoned because he refused the advances of his master's wife.
Oh, man, talk about insult to injury.
And of course, she lies and blames him. It's like this cascade of terrible things happening to him.
It's really hard to imagine going through even one of those things, let alone all of them.
Right. You'd think he'd be so full of resentment and anger, feeling completely abandoned by God, right?
Yeah, that would be a natural human reaction, I think.
Absolutely. You'd expect him to be like, God, where are you in all of this? Why is this happening to me?
Totally.
But here's the thing, and both sources really highlight this. Joseph doesn't direct that anger at God. He doesn't let his awful circumstances dictate how he views his relationship with the divine.
That's interesting. So even though everything is falling apart around him, he doesn't let it affect his faith.
Exactly. The texts emphasize that he stayed focused on God's presence. He didn't decide that just because his life was terrible, God's favor had disappeared.
That's a powerful way to look at it. It's like he's saying, my circumstances might be bad, but my connection with God is still strong.
Right. And it goes against our natural tendency, doesn't it?
Right.
We tend to think good times equal God's approval and bad times equal he's gone AWOL.
Oh, for sure. It's like we think our relationship with God is based on how good things are in our lives.
Exactly. But Joseph's story completely turns that idea on its head.
So what happens next? He's in prison, holding onto his faith. What does that look like?
Well, it's not just a passive thing, he's just waiting it out. The texts specifically mention that even in prison, God was with him. It says God showed him mercy and, get this, gave him favor in the eyes of the prison keeper. It's kind of mind-blowing, right?
Wow, yeah, you wouldn't expect that in prison. It's like even though he's locked up, God is still working in his life.
Right. It's like this paradox. He's wrongly accused in a terrible place, and yet he's finding favor.
So are they saying that God's presence can be found even in the worst possible places?
Yeah, that seems to be the point they're making. It's like his presence isn't limited by our physical location or our situation. Even in the darkest, most unjust places, it's still there.
So even when things seem hopeless, there's still hope because God is present.
That's the idea. And the sources highlight that this presence isn't just some feel-good thing. It has actual real-world effects, even if it doesn't immediately fix the problem.
So how did that play out for Joseph?
Well, in his case, because of the favor he found, he was given more responsibility within the prison.
Okay, so even in prison, things start to look up for him.
Right. And then the sources point out, because the Lord was with him, whatever he did prospered. Even in prison.
That's wild. So even though he's still in this unjust situation, there's this pocket of blessing around him.
Exactly. It's like this little island of good in this sea of bad. And it really paints this powerful picture. It's not saying the bad disappears, but that even in the midst of it, God's presence can bring about some good.
That's a really encouraging thought.
It is. But it's not just about Joseph's story, right? The sources are presenting this as a direct lesson for us.
Oh, okay. So how do they want us to apply this to our own lives?
They're saying, look, just like Joseph, you got to fight that urge to let your hard times define you. Don't let the injustice you're facing become the main way you see your relationship with God. Instead, make a conscious effort to be aware of his constant presence, no matter what things look like on the outside.
So it's like actively choosing to focus on God's presence, even when things are really tough.
Exactly. And both pieces kind of hint at this promise. They say that by holding onto that perspective, by keeping your hope in the Lord, you'll eventually, and I love how they put this, rise to prominence, experience God's favor no matter where you are.
So it's not necessarily saying the problem will magically disappear, but that even in the midst of it, there's potential for good things to happen.
Exactly. It's like saying that even in that tough situation, there's room for growth, for influence, for things to change because of God's presence.
I like that. It's not just about escaping the hardship, it's about how you handle it internally.
Right. And by grounding yourself in that faith, in his unwavering presence and favor, you build up this resilience, this inner strength that lets you not just survive, but potentially thrive in those hard situations.
It's like shifting your focus from the unfairness of it all to the strength of your connection with God.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings us back to that core idea, right? It's
Yeah.
all about holding onto that faith, truly believing in God's constant presence and favor, even when everything around you seems to contradict it.
It's like saying, I don't understand why this is happening, but I still believe God is with me.
Right. That's where the real strength comes from. That's where you find the power to persevere and maybe even see that positive change happen eventually.
It's a really powerful concept.
It is. And, the devotional even quotes this amazing passage from Psalm 139. It says, "Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there."
Wow.
Right. It really drives home that idea of God's omnipresence, that no matter how low you sink, how dark it gets, his presence is a constant.
It's like saying there's literally nowhere you can go where God isn't.
Exactly. And it speaks to that deep human question we all have,
Hmm.
where is God in all this suffering?
Like when bad things happen, it's easy to feel like God is distant or absent.
Right. But Psalm 139 is saying, no, the answer isn't absent. It's everywhere. And what's cool is your sources then connect this back to Joseph and say, look, this is how it plays out practically.
Okay, so how does this idea of omnipresence translate into action?
It's about how you respond to injustice. It's not about being passive or ignoring the wrong that's been done. It's about choosing not to let bitterness and anger toward God take root in your heart.
It's like actively choosing to trust God even when you don't understand why things are happening.
Exactly. It's about focusing on that ever-present connection, trusting in his favor, even when your experiences seem to contradict it.
That's a tough thing to do, but it seems like that's the key takeaway here.
Yeah, and it really ties everything together, doesn't it? Both sources are basically shouting this one truth. God's presence and favor aren't fickle. They don't depend on your latest win or how comfortable you are.
It's like they're saying these things are constants, unwavering parts of your relationship with God.
Exactly. They're like anchors you can hold on to, especially when you're going through those really unfair moments. And Joseph's story, his journey from betrayal to slavery to prison, and then ultimately to a position of power, it's like this incredible real-life example of what can happen when you keep that focus on God's presence no matter what.
It's a powerful testament to the idea that God can work even in the worst of circumstances.
It is. And it brings us to this crucial question for you. When you find yourself in a tough situation, one that feels especially unfair, where does your mind go first?
It's like asking yourself, do I focus on the injustice or do I focus on God's presence?
Right. Do you zero in on the pain, on feeling abandoned, or can you, even in the middle of that mess, find a way to recognize and hold on to the belief that God is present and that his favor is still there?
That's a challenging question, but it's definitely worth considering.
Totally. So as you go about your day, maybe think about a challenge you're facing right now. Ask yourself, how could shifting your focus, even just a little bit, from the weight of the problem to the potential for God's presence and favor to show up, actually change your perspective? Could it even impact your actions?
That's a really interesting thought.
It is, right. And what would it look like for you to really believe deep down that his presence with you isn't limited by your circumstances, no matter how unjust they might feel? That's definitely something to chew on and explore on your own.
That's a great point to end on. It's really about making that internal shift from focusing on the problem to focusing on God's presence.
And who knows, that shift might just make all the difference.
It might.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a really thought-provoking conversation. Until next time.
See you then.